Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining the Black Doctoral Network Fall Series Workshop. This is the next to the last workshop in our series, and we're so excited that you decided to join us this morning. I am Dr. Nieta J. Scott Dunmore, a proud member of the Black Doctoral Network, where I serve on many committees, this being one. We have had 8 total Fall Series workshops, and this is number 7. And we will have number 8, the last one for the Fall Series, which will then transition into a Spring series at a later time. I am more than happy and excited to introduce you to our speaker for today, who is Dr. Nicole Joseph, who is a Doctor of Education, Higher Education, and Higher Education Administration. And she graduated from Manhattanville College in Purchase, New York, which is 30 miles from the Big Apple. She also will tell you her connection to the Westchester Community College as Division Coordinator. She will also tell you a little bit more about herself as time goes on within this workshop. The name of the workshop today is Developing a Conceptual Framework, the Blueprint for Qualitative Research. As many of you know, there's several types of research methodologies: quantitative, qualitative, descriptive, analytical, applied, fundamental, exploratory, conclusive, surveys, and case studies. But today, we will be talking about qualitative research and its methodology. Some housekeeping rules. Please mute unless you're getting ready to speak or ask a question. If you feel as though you would like to ask a question, please feel free to put it in the chat, as I will be moderating and also monitoring the chat. Also, we have in 2 days the Black Doctoral Virtual Conference, which is only 2 days away, and it's 3 packed days of panels, workshops, poster presentations, and keynote speakers. Begins October the 28th through October the 30th, and yes, you can still register. There are day passes, as well as if you'd like to register for 3 full days. We also have continuous events in the Black Doctoral Network, which is the BDN workshop series, which is on Tuesdays, which you're attending now. The last one will be next Tuesday, and it will be at 4 o'clock. We also have Black Doctors Talk on Wednesdays, Conversation Starters web series on Thursdays. And of course, Google Black Doctoral Network and look at our website for all types of job opportunities, fellowship opportunities as well. And think about joining us, because membership has its privileges. Last housekeeping rule before I turn it over to Dr. Joseph is that I will put the survey link in the chat, probably more than once, as to remind you to please complete our survey, so we'll know how we're doing and actually what we need to do a little bit differently. So without further ado, Dr. Nicole Joseph, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Hello, everybody. It's good to see you, or your name. Thank you for joining my workshop. Just briefly, I just want to say in the chat, there's a couple of slides that I will ask some questions on slido.com. So if you look in the chat, if you can go there now, www.slido.com, and you would put in the number 187611. And so that is just for participation, or you can certainly ask a question or communicate verbally. That's perfectly fine. And I just also want to add that during my presentation, it's okay if you have a question as I'm going through, that's all right. But I am going to be sharing, so if you put it in the chat, I might not catch it. So you may want to actually speak up, even if you raise your hand, because my screens will be with the PowerPoint. But thank you for that introduction, Dr. Scott Dunmore. As she said, my name is Dr. Nicole Joseph, and I graduated from Manhattanville College. And I graduated undergrad at University of Connecticut. I have my master's degrees from University of Bridgeport, and I have one from Teachers College. And I learned this strategy in terms of a conceptual framework in my graduate program. And I don't want to say it's the way to do it, but it's a way. And I teach a coaching course at Manhattanville College. And I've talked to my students and I've shared this with them, and they have said that this has been very helpful and it has simplified it for them. So without further ado, I'm just going to get into the process of creating a conceptual framework. And I don't know if you saw my video, but I will just reiterate that it wasn't until I created my framework that I felt like I was making headway on my literature review, and it did help provide some guidance for me in terms of creating the edges of my study throughout my dissertation process. And so I really think it's important for some type of research, meaning qualitative research. So I'm going to start to share my screen. Oops. Okay, can everyone see that?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. So I can't really see you now. So if you have any questions or comments or concerns, as I say in my class, please feel free to speak up. Thank you. Let me move this over here. So if you can just share with me, you can do it verbally or you can go into Slido. What have you learned about conceptual frameworks? What are some of the things that you know about them, think about them, questions you may have in general? I just want to get a sense of where you are. And you don't have to type it in, you can also say it if you would like to. Maybe 1 minute. Is anyone typing in? Okay, good. So we have a way to organize one's research. Absolutely. It definitely helped me organize my research. 1 more minute. Okay. We're going to move forward. So there are two terms that I heard interchangeably. And when I went back to school, went back for my doctoral program, you hear theoretical framework and conceptual framework, and people use them interchangeably, as I said. And I said, you know what, I've done this before. I can't remember. I know I did this in a couple of papers in my graduate program. So how did this work? So let me just break this down to you. And you're still going to hear these terms used in various ways. But this is how I think of it. And these are not my words. However, when I was looking for definitions, these were very close to how I think about it. So a theoretical framework is a single formal theory in which the research problem is understood and investigated. So if you think about your dissertation, you think about your research question, and then you start to research theories that you may need or you may use to look at your research question or to look at your research. So that it may include one theory or two theories, and you might combine them in some ways, which we'll talk about more. But a conceptual framework, it includes one or more formal theories in part and whole, as well as other concepts and empirical findings from the literature. And so that will be made clear to you in a few more minutes. And we'll talk about how a conceptual framework is made. So think of it this way. If you use one particular theory in your research, in your dissertation, which actually I did, I ended up using one theory, I used Black feminist thought, then you can consider that a theoretical framework. That's your theoretical framework. If you take tenets or principles from another theory and you combine them, then you're actually creating a concept. You're not creating a new concept. You're not developing a new theory, but you're creating a new framework just for your dissertation, and that would be a conceptual framework. And please, if you have any questions as we move along, feel free to ask. And so, as I said, the conceptual framework for me, what it did is it provided the lens in which to view my research problem. And so what does that mean? it means that you have a very specific way of looking at things. And I ask my students all the time, I say, tell me what you want to study in very practical terms. What do you want to know? And so sometimes I think we get, as doctoral students, we get kind of caught up in trying to sound very scholarly before we have a real practical understanding of what we're trying to research. And so I really ask students, just tell me in layman's terms, what do you want to know? What do you want to study? And so once you have that foundational understanding, then you can start to really research and do deep dives into possible theories that might work for your literature review. The conceptual framework also limits the scope of your study. So what it did for me, because you come across so much great information, right? There's the sea of research out there, but you can't use everything, and you don't want to use everything. And they say the best dissertation is a done dissertation, and I believe that very strongly. And so it limits what you will, when you read something, you'll say, okay, I can use this. This kind of fits, or this sounds really good, but this doesn't really fit where I want to go. And it also, for me, it helped me organize my lit review. It helped me with my methodology. It helped me with my interview protocol, and it helped me with my findings. But there was a little bit of a switch with my findings, which I'll get to when we continue. I see something in the chat. Okay, let's move on. So let's start with an example. So this was actually a paper that I had written in graduate school, and this was the first time that I tried to do a conceptual framework. And so the topic was strategic organizational change. And I am an administrator in higher education. And for those of you who work in higher ed, you know that we are always put on committees, right? And every time there is an issue or a problem, there's a task force. There's something, some group that's developed to look at the desired change and to decide how to move forward. And so I was thinking about that. And there's always, not always, but typically in my experience, there's a question of, well, how do we get our faculty members to buy into this change? We're administrators, so how do we get faculty members to buy into this change? So if this were, for example, a research question, very basic topic, right? How do change agent groups, a change agent group is just another way of saying a committee, engage faculty members in higher education to contribute to organizational change initiatives that they do not view as vital to their institutions? So just basically, how do I get faculty to understand that this is important to the institution as a whole, even though it might be something that is started or facilitated by administrators? And so that was the topic of my paper. So the assignment was to develop a conceptual framework in which to address this topic. And so this is very much, so this is what I did. So I looked at, I found, this isn't a theory, it was a perspective. I found it in a paper. And like I said, this was a paper, so it wasn't a dissertation. And it was called the Faculty Participation Perspective. And in this particular perspective, there were 3 tenets of it. And so it was interesting because basically the tenets were that faculty have the right to participate within the institution with any new initiative within the institution, that there's greater satisfaction on morale within the institution when faculty participate and when faculty buy into whatever the new initiative is, and that it also, when faculty participates, that it provides legitimacy to whatever the change is. And so this was just one of the perspectives, theories, you know, as I was doing some research, I was typing in faculty, I was typing in participation, change agent groups, things of that nature. And so I found this perspective and I said, okay, this sounds pretty good, right? So that's one. But remember, the research question is coming from an administrator point of view of how we get faculty to buy in, especially if faculty do not think that it's important to what their goals are. And so this was the second perspective that I found. It's called the change agent group perspective. And I think this is probably where change agent came in. So I probably didn't start off researching change agents. I was just started off with committees and group work and higher education committees, things of that nature. And so these were the tenets or the principles in this particular perspective. One was how the group sees itself in relations to the organization. So is this a new group that is formed? Is it an established group? What are the power dynamics there? The next one was the composition of the group, the individual members and how they interacted. And so are there some key folks in this particular group that have some power, that have some perceived power, or are there any faculty members? Are there people who are union members? And so the individual members of the group and the composition of the group is also very important. The emotional engagement. How does the group relate to each other? How does the group communicate? Is it a supportive environment? So how does the group engage with each other, right? And the last one was stakeholder relations, groups relationships within the organization. So how is this group? Is it if it's new, it may have a different perception, or if it's an established group, how does this group relate as a whole to the organization? And so I found these two perspectives and I said, okay, so I need to create a lens, a way of looking at my research question. And remember, the research question was, how does a change agent group connect with faculty, or convince them that to accept a change if it's something that they don't really support. I know I didn't say that exactly, but that's done. And so again, how do change agent groups engage faculty members in higher education to contribute to organizational change initiatives that they do not view as valid to their institutions? And so I decided to take just two of the tenets from the first framework, that there's greater satisfaction and morale within the institution when faculty participate, and that it provides legitimacy to the change. And then I took two from the second perspective, how the group sees itself in relation to the organization and stakeholder relations and groups relationships within the organization. So it could be individual group members within that group and their connection to the organization or the group as a whole. And so by just taking these couple, so I kind of like a recipe, I kind of took a pinch of this, a pinch of that from these two perspectives. And from that, I created my conceptual framework, and I gave it a name. And I remember this was very important to me because my professor in this particular class asked us to actually name our new conceptual framework. We weren't creating a theory, but it was a name so that we could follow it throughout our paper. So I called it the engagement conceptual framework. And so through this new conceptual framework, we could look at shared governance. So we could look at how change agent groups must connect with various departments. So it's important. So how do, again, going back to the research question, how do change agent groups engage faculty members in higher education to contribute to organizational change that they don't view as vital? Well, you have to remember that higher education, we work through shared governance. So the change agent group has to connect with different departments, right? And then group dynamics, that there has to be a common purpose. And then you have to bring the faculty perspective into greater focus into this area. So I created the engagement conceptual framework in a way to address some of these issues. And so in this paper, what I did was I talked about the first perspective, the faculty engagement perspective. And I talked about what it meant for greater satisfaction and morale, and what those elements might include, and what that looks like in an institution when faculty feel appreciated, and when faculty buy into a new initiative. And I talked about the difference between an initiative that was supported by faculty, it was more legitimate, versus an initiative that wasn't. And then I also talked about the other perspective. I talked about how the group saw itself, a change agent group, and what it was. What's a change agent group, and how does it see itself, and what are the members, and the stakeholder relations. So that was kind of the background, right? And so it's similar to what I did in my dissertation. And then I talked about the engagement conceptual framework, and then that was the lens in which I could address this question. Any questions about anything that I've just shared? So let me just ask you, based on the framework that I just shared with you, what may be possible like research keywords or areas of research that you would use as you were doing some research, just based on what we just talked about? And then next, I'm going to actually show you what I did for my dissertation. Would anybody like to share? And I can't see you, so.
I don't see anything in the chat right now. Feel free to unmute if you'd like to talk. You don't have to put anything into the chat if you don't like to, if you don't want to.
Okay.
You can unmute yourself.
All right, I'm going to move forward. All right, so I just wanted to share with you, I see something in the chat, let me just check. That's okay. I wanted to share with you my my dissertation, or part of my dissertation. And so I decided to research myself, basically. And so I was interested in the experiences of Black women administrators in higher education, because I had some pretty interesting experiences, because I'm a Black woman in higher ed, and I have many colleagues and friends. And so as I was thinking about my topic, I said, you know what, I was thinking about more student-centered topics, but I was really drawn to doing something about administration. And I was also drawn to this theory. And I first came across this theory, Black feminist thought, in graduate school, in my master's program. And so I kind of went back to that, and I fell in love with it all over again. And so this was my research problem. So it's Black women have served in institutions of higher education as administrators and faculty members for over a century in the United States. However, institutions from predominantly white colleges and universities to community colleges have failed to fully embrace their intellect and unique standpoints they bring to the academy. They are not given proper credit for their scholarship, ideas, and leadership contributions that richly enhance the culture and mission of these institutions. And opportunities for advancement and mobility are not granted for many of these women, and the chance for progress in the academy is halted due to their race. And so this was, I went through a couple, of course, iterations of this, and this is where I landed in terms of a research problem. I want to share my research questions. And so my research questions were, what are the race-based experiences of mid-level Black women administrators in community colleges? And so my original topic idea, of course, was way too broad, right? I can't study higher education and all, I wasn't interested in studying presidents and vice presidents, so I wasn't looking on the executive level. And then, of course, my professors and chairperson said, well, you gotta narrow the scope. What do you want to look at? What do you want to look at? So we kept narrowing and narrowing and narrowing. And I said, okay, I guess I'm just looking at myself. And so my my career in higher education has been in community colleges. And so that's where I landed. I said, okay, so what are the race-based experiences of mid-level Black women administrators in community colleges? And so I labeled mid-level as deans and directors, and that was pretty much the scope. So it could be an assistant dean, and I think I had a coordinator just because in that particular institution, the coordinator was another term for director. And how have experiences with being marginalized shaped how Black women lead in community colleges? And of course, again, coming in some ways from my own experiences, but also from conversations with my colleagues over a span of 20 odd years. And what are Black women's administrators' perceptions of their impact on their institution's culture? And so even though as a Black woman administrator, we're dealing with microaggressive behavior on a daily basis, and we feel that we're being treated unfairly, we're still doing great work. We're still change agents. We're still making some huge strides within our institutions. And so what do we think in terms of our impact? And so those were my research questions. And I landed on Black feminist thought because it offers the unique experiences of African-American women as administrators in community colleges, because it posits race has a direct impact on the experiences and opportunities of African-American women. And Black feminist thought, one of the reasons I fell in love with it, and you may be familiar with the theory, is because it just felt like home. It felt like me. It talked about, for example, intellect as being not just the intellect of having a credential or of having a degree, but it spoke of intellect as the wisdom of our grandmothers and our great-grandmothers and our aunts. And I thought that was really important. It talked about the lived experiences as being a source of wisdom and intellect. And so that was one of the things that grabbed me. It also talked about principles such as being the outsider within, of the fact that Black women are often kind of in different margins, right? We know how to quote unquote play the game, right? So we know how to act within our professional domains, and then we know how to act without, or we know how to be within our families and with our churches and our sororities and our communities. And so we have this ability to transform and go back and forth. It also talks about being the outsider within, historically, in terms of Black women serving and being maids within white households within history. And my great-grandmother, certainly, I could relate to that in remembering how a white family would send her stuff every year, way past that she worked, because they felt that she was so much a part of the family, but we had never met them because she had worked in their homes when she was younger. And so I was just really drawn to Black feminist thought. And so one of the like I said, the Black feminist thought is very dense, but towards the end of the book, Dr. Collins talks about the domains of power, and these domains organize relations in society. And so the domains of power are structural, disciplinary, hegemonic, and interpersonal. So let me just start. Before I landed only on Black feminist thought, my idea was I'm going to use Black feminist thought and critical race theory. Those were the two theories that I was going to use for my research. And as I delved deeper into them, as I was doing more writing in my first couple of drafts of my lit review on and learning more about Black feminist thought as well as critical race theory, the only thing I was really taking from critical race theory was the idea of counter narratives. And then at some point I said to my chair, I don't think I need critical race theory because I can talk about the lived experiences from Black feminist thought. And she's like, yeah. So I decided to drop critical race theory. And so I landed on just Black feminist thought. And so I looked at the domains of power. So structural organizes oppression in society, education, healthcare, and I don't know what I was trying to write there, so forgive me for that error. And disciplinary, the organizational practices of managing oppression, hegemonic or hegemonic, however you pronounce it, the system of ideas developed by the dominant group to justify practices. And then interpersonal, how individuals uphold the subordination of others on a daily basis. So these are just in general what these domains of power means. But through the lens of Black feminist thought, as Dr. Collins talked about it, this is how she talked about the domains of power. So for structural, it was how systems organize themselves to maintain the subordination of Black women. So how the larger societal systems such as healthcare and the criminal justice system and education, those are the structural systems that she's talking about. For disciplinary, it was how organizations and their bureaucratic systems maintain the oppressive status of women. So once Black women are within these structures, so once you are a member or employee of an institution in education, for example, how within that institution you are marginalized, right? So what does that look like? So first you might be marginalized by the larger societal system, but then once you do get in, what does that look like? And then hegemonic is the stereotypical or common sense ideas of Black womanhood that are perpetuated within the system. And so the idea that Black women are strong, which could have negative and positive connotations, or angry, right, or loud, or whatever stereotype might be ascribed to Black women. And then interpersonal is the simple, ordinary ways that Black women combat racism and racist acts. So how do we, as Black women, go through these experiences on a daily basis and still survive? How do we come home at the end of the day? What are our support systems? What are some of the things that we do so that we can go back into and knowing that we're going to still have these experiences? And so that led me. So this was in Dr. Collins's book. This is her her framework, right? I'm going to skip this. So this is what I took from Dr. Collins. And so I call this the outsider within conceptual framework. And so I said, okay, we talked about structural. What does structural mean? Structural are the larger institutions, right? Healthcare, education, the criminal justice system. But for my dissertation, what I wanted to look at was community colleges. So I'm looking at higher education, I'm looking at community colleges. And with community colleges, what were the purposes of community colleges? Why were they established in this country? And so they were institutions of social justice. And I wanted to also talk about their institutional climate and their institutional culture. And so from the theory, Black feminist thought, I took one of the tenets, which was the structural domain of power. And then I connected it to what I wanted to look at within my dissertation, which is community colleges, right? For disciplinary, I wanted to look, so disciplinary, if you remember, once you get past the larger structure and you're within an organization. And so how are Black women marginalized once you're in the institution or within that structure? And so I looked at recruitment, retention, and advancement of Black women. So are Black women recruited into key positions within community colleges, and how are they retained? Do they come in the door and they're just stopped? They're not looked at? What systems are in place to help in terms of mentoring, in terms of promotions, in terms of advancement? And so those are the three areas that I landed on for my. And hegemonic is connected to another concept, lived experiences. Hegemonic talks about the everyday experiences, right? And so what were the experiences with microaggressions and overt racism? And lastly was interpersonal. So interpersonal, I looked at how do Black women support each other? What are the support groups? Family, faith, spirituality. How do Black women still become change agents, even though they're experiencing microaggressive behavior on a daily basis? And so this was the lens. This is my conceptual framework. And I call it the outsider within conceptual framework, which is Dr. Collins' term. It's not my term, but I used it for my dissertation. It's not something I can publish or anything of that nature because it's her term, but I used it for my own dissertation. But in this way, I was able to look at, this was the lens for how Black women reflect and manage racist and misogynistic interactions, the resources that they use to address their effects on their professional and personal lives, and the extent their leadership and interpersonal skills impacts the relationships and culture within their institutions. And so this became my framework. And so based on this, I'm saying, okay, this is where I want to land. This is how I organized my lit review. So of course I started with my purpose and purpose of chapter 2 and the history. And now this is where I start to create the edges. So if I'm going to talk about Black feminist thought, I'm going to talk a little bit about Black feminism. And what else might people want to know? Well, if I'm going to talk about Black feminism, I'm going to talk a little bit about the feminist movement. And I also need to talk about, I'm talking about education. So I think I want to also bring in Black women in higher education and the history there. And so this is where I had a lot of fun. I learned so much about myself. I learned a lot about my topic, of course. But this is how I started to organize my lit review. And so purpose of the study, purpose of chapter 2, history of African-American women in higher education. I talked about the feminist movement. I talked about Black feminism, Black feminism and scholarship, and then Black feminist thought. So now here I talk about my theory. Now, as you can see, now I start talking about, here is where my my conceptual framework comes in. So structural environment, right? So this is the community college. So I gave a historical overview of community colleges. I talked about the community college as the climate and the culture of community colleges. And then the next was the disciplinary. And I talked about recruitment, not talked about, but researched on recruitment, retention, and advancement of Black women in these roles, specifically in mid-level roles. Under hegemonic, I talked about or researched leadership and intersectionality. So what were some, how do Black women lead? What are our leadership styles? Not that we're not monolithic. We don't all have the same leadership styles, but I wanted to know, does our culture impact our leadership? And what are some of the stereotypes ascribed to Black women within the institutions in which we work? And what are some of the what are the microaggressions that we encounter? And microaggressions, I took from Darren Sue, and so I talked about micro assaults, micro insults, and micro invalidations. And then finally, it was the interpersonal. And that was our support. So how do we attend to our overall well-being, especially in a professional environment? And so organizations such as the Black Doctoral Network would certainly be an example. Mentoring, support networks, our counter spaces, what are those places within the institutions that where we can go and we can talk to people or share our experiences, especially as when we're young and in these environments where we're just confused. We're not even sure what we're encountering sometimes, and we need to go and speak to someone to say, Okay, I certainly had the benefit of mentors like that, who would sit me down and say, okay, wipe your tears, don't let anybody see you cry. And this is what's going on, and explain things to me in a way over and over again, where I could kind of see it for myself and understand what was happening. And then how are Black women still change agents within their institutions? And then summarize. So this is an outline of my dissertation, of my literature review. And as you can see, my conceptual framework was a huge part of that. And so I mentioned that it also informed my interview protocol. So this is, and I don't expect you to read all of this, but this was my interview protocol. I had 13 questions with a lot of sub-questions. I interviewed 17 women in 2 different states from 10 different organizations. They were deans, directors, as I said before. But I did actually divide my questions up into my framework. So I knew I had questions that kind of covered all areas of my framework. And so structural, just tell me briefly about yourself, how you came to your position. And these aren't in the order in which I asked them. The last slide was, but I just want to show you how I was able to think of additional questions when in using my framework. Where does your position fit within your college's organizational chart? What contribution to your work do you value the most? These are more conversational leading up questions leading into my my interview. And please describe common knowledge about Black women that is prevalent at your institution. So again, more questions about the institution in general, and my participants' place within the institution. Disciplinary, just a couple of examples. Share experiences when you felt your work was valued, and share experience when you didn't feel like your work was valued. Share marginalizing experiences that are seemingly minor incidents, but prompted reflection about yourself or your organization. And how did these experiences inform how you contribute within your college? And then hegemonic, do you ever feel invisible or silenced? If so, how do you respond in those situations? In what ways have your professional aspirations been affected by your workplace experiences? How does Black female leadership look like to you? How do you lead? Does your race affect how you lead? Does your gender affect how you lead? How have you challenged stereotypes about Black women in your professional role? And then lastly, describe your interpersonal style. How do you communicate? Has your interpersonal style helped your professional life? What does your support network look like? Who does it include? Do you have mentors? Are they the same race? Have you used your position to enact change? And so these were the questions that I used for my participants. And I had the best conversations. And I think I have to say this, my questions really did make a huge difference. I have been a participant in studies as well. And I've had some colleagues share some of their outcomes, and your interview protocol really makes a huge difference in your conversation and the information that you're going to get. If you're going to get very rich information that you can use for your findings, or if you're going to kind of get more closer to yes or no answers, which you don't want. You want the stories, right? And so I can say with confidence that after going through 17 interviews with this protocol, that I got the best information and I had the greatest conversations with my participants. And so I just want to share with you again, these were the 5 major themes that came from my my questions. One was microaggressions, that everybody experienced microaggressions of the 17. 10 of them had doctoral degrees, all of them had master's degrees. Everyone experienced microaggressions. Micro-invalidation was a huge one, especially sitting in committee meetings and being ignored or saying something and having somebody else restate it, someone not a person not of color restate it, and then having it celebrated, when you as a Black woman has just said something and then it's completely ignored. White privilege was another, burden bearers, meaning that we have to kind of balance these roles. People thinking that we're angry or not qualified, we can't show our emotions, we have to toddle between these two, between the lines. Sankofa leadership, basically Black women have, or my participants really did try to become mentors and become advocates for students. And so that was a way to kind of help to alleviate some of the microaggressive behavior. And then mentorship. That mentorship was pivotal in terms of having mentors and being mentors. And one thing, mentorship, it didn't matter what race of mentors. So my participants talked about mentors who were white men and white women, and Hispanic men and Hispanic women. The mentors did not have to be Black. It just mentors who really just took an interest and recognized their skill set. So not to go too much into my dissertation, which I have a tendency to do. And again, this is just another way of looking at my conceptual framework, how it weaved through my lit review, it weaved through my questions, and it actually weaved through my findings. Now, when I went to my chapter 5, I said, oh, great, I'm gonna write according to my conceptual framework. And I hated it. And I was like, okay, I don't know what to do. It's just a terrible chapter 5, but I needed to get it something to my committee members. And so I did it according to my framework, but I felt like I was leaving too much on the table. And so this is where, it's a process. And so I talked to my chairperson. She said, well, throw it out. You've used it, get rid of it, flip it. And I did. And so when it got to chapter 5, and I wanted to really talk about and discuss what I had found, my chapter 5 is actually organized according to my findings. And in that way, I didn't leave anything on the table. I felt much better about it. I loved writing it. And so, that's just part of the dissertation process. So questions to consider as you are thinking about a conceptual framework. Number 1, what theory, perspective, or concepts do you plan to use for your study? If it's 1 or 2, if you're using more than 1, then you might be looking at what that theory says, and what are the principles of that theory. And a way of doing that is to, of course, do your research. You can look at other authors and how they've used the theory, but they're not just taking the theory in whole, they're taking some specific parts of that theory. And so you might take a little from this theory, a little from that theory, and then that's how you're developing your own conceptual framework. And you're developing that lens for how to look at your work. So you want to look at who were these theories originally proposed by, what was the purpose, because when you use a theory or perspective in your research, you're going to have to provide information about it. You're going to have to provide a background on it. What other sources do you want to cite that uses the theory? So that's when it becomes that's when you start looking at the reference section of those articles, and you start seeing those original sources over and over, or you start seeing new sources, and that's a way to research. What other sources do I want to cite using this, that uses this theory? As I said before, what are the specific tenets? You need to understand it, and you don't need to use the whole thing. You can take something from it and combine it with something else. What tenets of the theory relate to my study? And that again goes back to very practically, what is it that you want to study in layman's terms without trying to sound very scholarly? And I think a lot of my students get kind of caught up with that. And when I ask them to just say it in very plain language, they'll say, well, this is really what I want. And then I'll say, okay, well, you don't need this other theory, right? Look at it. Does that really fit what you want? And they'll say, no. Okay, well, then that kind of sends you in another direction. And then how will you adapt the theory or theories to your study? And so these are things that you want to consider as you are looking for theories and trying to develop that conceptual framework for your work. And so I think at this time, I would like to entertain any questions that you may have.
Thank you, Dr. Joseph. Are there any questions from anyone? Please feel free to unmute yourselves.
Hello, good morning. This is Deirdre Henderson. And I don't actually have a, question, more of a comment. I thank you for kind of breaking down theoretical framework and conceptual framework, because like you stated, they are used interchangeably. So when I'm asked to do one or the other, I'm, in the beginning trying to figure out, well, aren't they the same thing? But this really helped to make it clear that how they're different.
Oh, good. Thank you. I'm glad.
And I actually think, I'm not sure, I have to go back and look. I think I ran across your dissertation. I think when I was looking for information, I'm just beginning working on mine. So when I was looking for information, because your last name sounds very familiar, and I have to look through all the stuff I printed, because I think I ran across it just to see if there was anything in there that, I could use for mine, or that kind of applied, to what I'm doing.
Well, it's the title begins with feeling some kind of way. So that was, if you've seen that, then yeah, that was me.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Yeah, I think that's it. All right. But thank you. This has been very helpful.
Oh, good.
Thank you so much. Thank you. There's a comment in the chat.
Okay.
Really interesting to see that you threw away your CF. I advise my students to reshape it based on their findings. They may revise it significantly, creating a new perspective. Do you have any thoughts on that, Dr. Joseph?
You're saying it's interesting that I threw in this conceptual framework in my chapter 5?
Yes.
Well, maybe throwaway is the wrong term. I just, in my mind, I was planning on writing my findings according to my conceptual framework, because it had worked so well for me up to that point. But I just found that, as I said, there was so much I didn't say that I wanted to say from my interviews, that I had to figure out a different way. It didn't fit my conceptual framework. And I guess in some ways it's not supposed to fit, right? It's not supposed to just be circulars, and you're supposed to find new information. So you're not supposed to just kind of fill in the blanks. And so when I started the chapter 5, and again, it was, people, I don't know who, some people say chapter 5 is easy. I don't know who says that. No part of the dissertation was easy to me. So I don't know, but that was floating around. But I found myself back where I was in chapter 2, when I had created the conceptual framework of how do I organize this? And so when I say I threw it away, I had to rethink how to organize it, and organizing it according to my findings, which included my conceptual framework. So instead of using the conceptual framework as a macro way of organizing, I used it as in a micro way. So it was included in there, but it was included in a sentence within it instead of a section, if that makes sense.
Thank you, Dr. Joseph, for explaining that. And the other comments are thank you. This was very helpful. This was so helpful. Thank you so much. Does anyone else have any questions of Dr. Joseph?
Yes, if I may, please.
Yes.
In my comment about throwing it away, it sounds like you did something similar to what I advise my students to do. In that you used your empirical data to restate what you now sort of understood the picture to be. And I suppose, what I tend to advise my students to do is to reformulate it so that they have a new framework at the end, which reflects their data. So it sounds like similar things anyway. But my question, and I'm sorry that I joined late, so I missed your earlier exposition. I also found it really interesting that that you developed the framework before your lit review and used it to shape your lit review. So again, that's something that.
Well,
that
let me clarify that, because
Okay.
the this is a long process. This is the bear of the dissertation to me. And so in my coursework, so it was like the summer of whatever, so it was like the summer, that's when I did my first draft, and that's where I had in mind, that's where I really started to research both critical race theory and Black feminist thought. And so it took me a year to research and to develop the conceptual framework. And it wasn't to, and I was researching and reading and doing all of this deep dive in this literature and books. And then and my biggest problem was, how am I organizing this? Like, for me, the way I think, if I can get the framework, if I can get the organization, then I can work from there. And so once I established that, but that was really in the middle of the process. Once I established it, and I went through this year of research, when I actually sat down and to write it, and I said, okay, if I organize it according to my framework. So I started with my framework, and then I built out the edges as far as I thought. So for example, once I started with the framework, I said, okay, well, naturally, if I wanted someone to read this and feel comfortable with understanding this, I want to know more about the history of Black women in higher education and scholarship and Black feminism. And what does that even mean? And then if you want to know about Black feminism, you want to know about feminism. So I decided when to stop, but I didn't develop it before doing all of that. I did it in the middle of that. And so once I got to a point where I'm really pounding it out in terms of getting that lit review done, that's when I was able to really feel like I was on the right path, if that makes sense.
Yes, it does.
So it wasn't, I didn't just start the conceptual framework first, but you have, because you have to get into the literature, right, to discover the edges of the literature. You have to go past it to know what you're doing. So developing the conceptual framework doesn't negate that research process.
Thank you.
For me.
That makes perfect sense. My students tend to, in a sense, as you say, have done the lit review, and then they outline their framework, which helps to clarify their thoughts. And so it sounds very similar indeed. Thank you.
Right. But a lot of folks are like, well, what does that mean? What does the framework work? And it's not explained well. And this was a strategy that I learned, like, as I said, in a graduate course. And I remember it so explicitly because I struggled with it. And I was so intimidated by my faculty member. And when I repeated it back to her in a very simple way. So if I took a part of this theory and that theory and put it together, and that would be, and she was like, no. But when I did it exactly the way I thought, she was like, you did it. She was so proud of me. And I was so proud because I made her proud. And it was just, so it was, I still have the paper. And because she was such a tough professor, and it was like the skies opened up after that, because she's like, you did it. You, and I'm like, yeah, but I did it the way I had repeated it to you. But it's like, sometimes people like to make it seem a little bit more complicated than it is, I think. So that's why I always remembered it. And so, there's a reason for everything. So when I did get to my doctoral program, and that was probably like 10 years later, I remembered this strategy. And when I used it and then explained it to my students after the fact, it seemed to be very helpful.
Thank you for your question. And thank you, Dr. Joseph, for your response. The next question says, what resources do you recommend to better understand conceptual frameworks?
I don't have an answer to that, honestly. I actually keep looking around because I do talk about conceptual frameworks. I teach a coaching course, a dissertation coaching course at Manhattanville College. It's a 1-credit winner course. And I look around for sources just to make sure that I'm not saying something that is in conflict with anything that I find. It's hard. I don't have any. That might be something that I'll look and I may have to forward at another time, because They are used interchangeably, the terms conceptual framework and theoretical framework. There is no simplified definition or way of looking at it. Every time I read about it, if I didn't know for myself, I still would be confused. So that's why I thought this topic would be helpful for folks. And I think it's one of the topics that my students are drawn to more often than not. So I don't have any right now in short, but I will look into that.
Okay, and you have another, thank you for sharing your experience and insights. And that person said that she values also the rich content from interviews even more. There was a question in the chat also, if you can receive a copy of the presentation, but all attendees will receive the link for this presentation. And you may also find the recording on the Black Doctoral Network's YouTube channel. Another comment was that the lit review is a bear, and that Kim says she is struggling with it right now. Another comment is there's a paper by Vernon Trafford overlooking the conceptual framework, which is good. So I think that's an answer to one of the other questions.
What was that last name?
Vernon Trafford, T as in Tom, R-A-F-F-O-R-D.
Okay.
And thank you for that comment. There's time for about one more question before I'm gonna allow Dr. Joseph to wrap up everything in her own way. Is there any other questions or comments that you'd like to make? Anybody, you can come off mute if you'd like to.
This is Jatana McClinton, and I just signed on. I apologize because I live in Central Time and I was looking at the time incorrectly. Which is normal these days. So I hate that I missed your presentation. Will you share it with us?
Yes, that's what I just said, that it will be shared.
Okay,
and actually,
thank you so much.
everybody who signed up will get the link, and then also you can find everything on the YouTube channel.
Okay, great. Thank you.
The Black Doctoral Network. Okay, Dr. Joseph, the last few comments belong to you.
Well, I just want to thank you for having me. I hope the information that I shared with you was useful. I think any little tidbit that we can learn as we're going through this process is great, is valuable. I had a ball actually going through my doctoral program, and I'm really grateful for the support that I had there. The last thing I wanted to mention is a shameless plug. As I said, I have been teaching a dissertation coaching course in Manhattanville. However, I am branching out on my own. I've met with many students just on my own voluntarily. And so I'm starting to develop a business. So if you are interested in having a dissertation coach, please email me. We can talk and I can determine if it's something that I can assist you with. I'm pretty cheap right now because I'm just starting. So, but it's important to have thought partners as you're going through this process. I was very fortunate to have a very supportive cohort and chairperson who was always willing to have a thought, to just talk things out with me and help throw resources at me. However, a lot of folks don't have this. And so again, if you're interested in coaching in any way, please get in touch with me. My email is drnicolejoseph7@gmail.com. And it is a legitimate business, Lawson Consulting, professional development, and educational training.
Thank you, Dr. Joseph. And definitely, please reach out to her if you're in need of any help or either questions or just bouncing things off of her. And also, as I mentioned in the very beginning, the membership has its privileges. So definitely do consider joining the Black Doctoral Network. There are volunteer opportunities, as well as you get firsthand knowledge of every webinar, series, conversation starters, Black Doctors Talk. You get it before anyone else. And we'd love to have you to be a member of the network. Don't forget that our annual conference will be October the 28th through October the 30th. You still can register, even if you come in for one day. That's fine if you can't attend the entire 3 days. It's 3 days packed with panels, workshops, posters, presentations, and keynote speakers. We have some dynamic keynote speakers that will be attending and being with us too as well. There's also on the website lists for career opportunities as well as fellowship opportunities. So as I mentioned, we had 8 of the type of webinars and presentations that we had today with Dr. Joseph. She was number 7. The last one of the fall series will be next Tuesday at 4 p.m. with Dr. Dominique Decoux. And she is part 2. She came to us before earlier in the spring, for the spring fall series. And it seems as though the attendees wanted a little bit more. And the name of her workshop is Black Women Leaders, How to Secure a Seat at the Table. So again, that will be next Tuesday at 4 p.m. I will also be your moderator for that particular workshop too as well. But Dr. Joseph, on behalf of the Black Doctoral Network, we thank you so very much for lending your time, your expertise. We wish you the best of luck in your business, and we look forward to having you again. And thank you for all the attendees today. The survey link was put in the chat twice. So please fill out the survey so we can actually do whatever you like for us to do. And also, if you'd like for us to bring Dr. Joseph back, she's more than happy to do that. And if you have some other doctors that you would like to hear from and different types of expertise, please let us know. And we'll be glad to have you. And thank you for your questions and for your attention today. And thank you again and have a great day.